Welcome to Drowsworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the entire history of Halloween, a celebration born from humanity's desperate attempts to negotiate with death itself. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about how our ancestors tried to bribe ghosts with food and war, disguises to avoid being dragged into the afterlife. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. You might want to turn the lights down low, maybe put a fan on for a gentle hum. Get comfortable, because we're about to travel back more than 2,000 years to understand how a night of terror became a night of candy. Halloween as we know it today, with its cheerful pumpkins and costumed children, is the distant descendant of something far older and considerably more unnerving. It began not in America, not in the commercial landscape of the 20th century, but in the misty hills and dense forests of ancient Celtic lands, in what we now call Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Britain and France. There, in a world where the boundary between the living and the dead felt dangerously thin, the Celts observed a festival called Samhain, pronounced Samhain, marking the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, the darker half of the year. The Celtic year was divided into two primary seasons. The bright half began at Beltane in May, celebrating fertility, growth, and the warming of the earth. The dark half began at Samhain, around the end of October and beginning of November. When the days grew short, the crops were gathered, and the cold descended. This was not merely a change in weather. For the Celts, these transitions held profound spiritual significance. Samhain was one of 4 major festivals in the Celtic calendar, and it was perhaps the most important, the hinge upon which the year turned. At Samhain, which fell roughly around what we now recognize as October 31st and November 1st, the Celts believed the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin, almost transparent. The barriers that normally kept the spirits in their realm weakened, allowing them to cross over. This was not a comforting thought. These were not necessarily benevolent spirits coming to wish their descendants well. Some might be the honored dead, ancestors worthy of respect and remembrance. Others might be malevolent entities, hungry ghosts, or mischievous spirits intent on causing harm, stealing souls, or leading travelers astray. The landscape of Celtic spirituality was populated by a complex array of supernatural beings. There were the Aos, often pronounced ASC, the people of the mounds, ancient spirits or deities who dwelt in the otherworld, in burial mounds and wild places. They were powerful, unpredictable, and deserving of careful respect. Offerings were made to them, not out of love necessarily, but out of a prudent desire to keep them appeased, to avoid their wrath or their tricks. At Samhain, when the boundaries dissolved, these beings might walk abroad more freely, and humans needed to take precautions. The practical realities of life in ancient Celtic communities shaped how Samhain was observed. By late October, the final harvests were complete. The grain was threshed and stored. The animals that would not survive the winter had been slaughtered, their meat preserved by salting or smoking. The landscape itself seemed to die. The leaves fell, the grasses browned, the earth hardened. Winter was coming, a season of scarcity, cold, and potential starvation. It was a time when survival was uncertain, when the community's stores might run out before spring, when illness could sweep through and claim lives with brutal efficiency. In this context, death was not an abstract concept. It was a constant presence. People died young, children died frequently, women died in childbirth, men died in accidents or in conflicts with neighboring tribes. The dead were not distant or forgotten, They were recent, remembered, sometimes mourned deeply, and at Samhain it was believed they might return. The Celts prepared for Samhain with a mixture of reverence and anxiety. They lit great bonfires, communal fires that served multiple purposes. Fire was a source of light and warmth, yes, but it was also a tool of purification and protection. The Druids, the priestly class who served as religious leaders, judges, and keepers of knowledge, presided over these rituals. They would light the sacred bonfire, often on a hilltop, and people would gather around it. The fire was meant to honor the sun, which was weakening as the days grew shorter, and to provide a beacon of light against the encroaching darkness, both literal and spiritual. From these central bonfires, families would light torches and carry fire back to their homes to rekindle their hearth fires, which had been extinguished. The new fire, blessed and purified, would protect the household through the dark months ahead. The smoke from these fires was also believed to have protective qualities. People would drive their livestock between two bonfires. A ritual cleansing meant to safeguard the animals from disease and malevolent spirits. The cattle, sheep, and pigs that passed between these flames represented the wealth and survival of the community. In a world without grocery stores or reliable food preservation beyond salting and smoking, losing livestock to disease or supernatural interference could mean starvation. The animals were not merely property, they were life itself. A family's entire winter survival might depend on a few cows, a handful of pigs, some chickens. The ritual passage through purifying smoke was therefore not superstition for its own sake, but a desperate attempt to protect what little security existed against the uncertainties of winter. The gathering around the bonfire also served a social function that cannot be overlooked. Celtic communities were small, isolated, and dispersed across challenging terrain. Samhain brought people together from the surrounding countryside, creating opportunities for social bonding, for sharing news and stories, for arranging marriages, and for reinforcing communal identity. In the flickering firelight, with the darkness pressing in from all sides, people found comfort in numbers, in shared ritual, in the familiar faces of neighbors and kin. The feast that followed the ceremonial lighting of the fires was as much about community cohesion as it was about honoring the dead or celebrating the harvest. Food played a critical role in Samhain observances. The Celts prepared feasts, elaborate meals that celebrated the bounty they had managed to gather and preserve. But these feasts were not solely for the living. Places were set at the table for the dead, the ancestors who might return on this night. Portions of food and drink were left outside the home as offerings, not just to honor the dead, but to appease them, to ensure they would not cause trouble. A hungry ghost might be a dangerous ghost. Better to feed them and hope they would move on peacefully. The practice of leaving offerings extended beyond the household, at crossroads, at boundaries, at the edges of settlements. People would leave food for the wandering spirits, for the AOS. These were liminal spaces, places between and at Samhain. When boundaries were already blurred, such places became especially potent and potentially perilous. To pass through a crossroads on Samhain night without taking precautions was to invite trouble. Costume and disguise also emerged as part of Samhain traditions, though the reasons were less about playful dress-up and more about survival. If harmful spirits were abroad, one strategy was to avoid being recognized as human. People would wear masks or animal skins, disguising themselves so that wandering ghosts or malevolent fairies might mistake them for fellow spirits and leave them alone. Some sources suggest people would blacken their faces with ash from the sacred fires. Others might wear elaborate costumes made from straw or hides. The intent was protective camouflage, a way to move through a dangerous night without attracting the wrong kind of attention. Divination, the attempt to foresee the future, was another central element of Samhain. At this pivotal moment, when the year turned and the veils thinned, it was believed the future might be glimpsed. Young people, especially, would engage in rituals meant to reveal whom they might marry. Apples and hazelnuts, both abundant at this time of year and associated with wisdom and knowledge, featured prominently in these practices. An apple might be peeled in one long strip, and the peel tossed over the shoulder, where it would supposedly land in the shape of a future lover's initial. Nuts might be placed in the fire, each representing a potential suitor, and their behavior as they roasted, whether they burned quietly or popped violently, would indicate the nature of that future relationship. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to the ancient Celts and their negotiations with the spirit world. The Druids, those mysterious figures who held such power in Celtic society, performed more elaborate divination rituals. They interpreted omens, read signs in the natural world, and sought guidance from the other world. Their knowledge was passed down orally, never written, a deliberate choice that kept their wisdom exclusive and their power intact. What exactly they did during Samhain rituals remains partly unknown, shrouded in the mists of time and the fact that they left no written records. Much of what we think we know comes from later sources, from Roman observers who viewed the Celts as barbarians, or from Christian monks who recorded oral traditions centuries later, inevitably filtering them through their own beliefs. The Romans did encounter Samhain traditions when they conquered Celtic lands. Julius Caesar and later Roman historians wrote about the Celts and their Druids, often with a mixture of fascination and horror. They described human sacrifice, though the extent and nature of such practices remain debated by modern scholars. They described the Druids' reverence for oak trees and mistletoe, their role as judges and advisors, their lengthy training that could last 20 years, but their accounts were those of outsiders, conquerors describing the conquered, and must be read with caution. When the Romans occupied Celtic territories, they brought their own festivals. One was Feralia, a late October festival honoring the dead. Another was a celebration for Pomona, the Roman goddess of fruit and trees, whose symbol was the apple. Over time, as Roman and Celtic cultures intermingled, some blending of traditions likely occurred, though the extent is difficult to determine with certainty. The apple, already significant in Celtic Samhain divination, may have gained additional associations. The honoring of the dead, already central to Samhain, may have found echoes in Roman practices. But the most significant transformation of Samhain would come not from Rome, but from the rise of Christianity. As Christian missionaries moved through Celtic lands, beginning in earnest in the 5th and 6th centuries, they encountered deeply rooted pagan traditions. The approach taken by the Church was often one of adaptation rather than outright suppression. Rather than forbidding beloved festivals, Christian leaders sought to transform them, to overlay Christian meaning onto pagan practices, making conversion easier and less disruptive. In the 7th century, Pope Boniface IV consecrated the Pantheon in Rome to the Virgin Mary and all Christian martyrs, establishing a feast day to honor them. Initially celebrated in May, this feast was later moved by Pope Gregory III in the 8th century to November 1st, and he expanded it to honor all saints, known and unknown. This became All Saints' Day, also called All Hallows' Day. The night before, October 31st, became All Hallows' Eve, which eventually contracted linguistically into Halloween. The establishment of All Saints' Day on November 1st was almost certainly a deliberate attempt to Christianize Samhain. By placing a major Christian festival at the same time as the ancient Celtic observance, the Church provided a Christian alternative, a sanctioned way to acknowledge the dead and the supernatural within a Christian framework. Instead of fearing vengeful spirits and appeasing pagan gods, Christians were encouraged to honor the saints, the holy dead who had achieved salvation and could intercede with God on behalf of the living. Later, in the 10th century, the Church added another observance, All Souls' Day on November 2nd, specifically dedicated to praying for the souls of all the faithful departed who had not yet reached heaven, those still being purified in purgatory. This created a 3-day period focused on death, the afterlife, and the relationship between the living and the dead, a Christianized echo of the ancient Samhain. Despite these official Christian overlays, many of the old practices persisted, particularly in rural areas and among common people. The bonfires continued to be lit, though now they might be framed as celebrations of Christian saints rather than pagan rituals. The offerings of food continued, though they might be reinterpreted as acts of Christian charity or remembrance. The disguises and costumes persisted, though their meaning shifted and evolved. The deep-seated belief that the boundary between the living and the dead was thin at this time of year did not simply vanish. It adapted, took on new forms, and wove itself into the fabric of Christian observance in complex ways. In medieval Europe, practices associated with All Hallows' Eve began to take on characteristics that would eventually contribute to modern Halloween. Souling emerged as a tradition, particularly in Britain and Ireland. Poor people, often children, would go door to door on All Hallows' Eve or All Souls' Day, offering to pray for the dead in exchange for soul cakes, small round cakes marked with a cross. Each cake eaten represented a soul freed from purgatory. This practice bore a clear resemblance to later trick-or-treating, though its religious context was more explicit. Guising, another practice, involved people, particularly young people, dressing in costumes and going from house to house, performing songs, poems, jokes, or other tricks in exchange for food or coins. This was especially common in Scotland and Ireland. The costumes often represented the dead, ghosts, or supernatural creatures, maintaining that ancient link to the spirit world. Guising was both entertainment and a kind of playful begging, a communal activity that brought neighborhoods together during the dark days of early winter. The jack-o'-lantern, now so iconic to Halloween, also has roots in Celtic lands, though its original form was quite different from the cheerful pumpkins we know today. The tradition began in Ireland with carved turnips, not pumpkins. Turnips were hollowed out, carved with frightening faces, and lit from within with candles or embers. These grotesque lanterns were meant to represent souls trapped in purgatory or to ward off evil spirits. They were placed in windows or carried through the dark to light the way and provide protection. The legend most commonly associated with the jack-o'-lantern is that of Stingy Jack, an Irish folktale. Jack was a clever but wicked man who repeatedly tricked the devil. In various versions of the story, Jack traps the devil in a tree or tricks him in other ways, extracting promises that the devil will not claim Jack's soul. When Jack eventually dies, he is too sinful for heaven, but the devil, true to his word, refuses to take him to hell. Jack is condemned to wander the earth forever, with only a burning coal placed inside a carved turnip to light his way. He becomes Jack of the Lantern, doomed to roam in darkness. These carved turnips, with their flickering lights and grotesque faces, became a symbol of this in-between state of souls neither in heaven nor hell, wandering the dark spaces between life and death. They served as both a warning and a protection. a reminder of the supernatural world and a tool to keep its more malevolent inhabitants at bay. The persistence of these traditions, even as Christianity became dominant, speaks to their deep cultural roots. They addressed fundamental human anxieties about death, the afterlife, and the unknown. They provided rituals to navigate the transition from harvest to winter, from plenty to scarcity, from light to dark. They created a sense of community through shared observances, shared fears, and shared hopes for protection and survival through the long winter ahead. As we move deeper into Halloween's history, we will see how these ancient Celtic and medieval European traditions traveled across the Atlantic, how they transformed in the New World, how they encountered new influences and took on new forms, eventually becoming the Halloween we recognize today, a holiday far removed from its origins, yet still carrying, in strange and subtle ways, echoes of those ancient fears and beliefs, those bonfires lit against the dark, those offerings left for the wandering dead. Halloween comes to America, immigration, transformation, and the birth of modern traditions. The story of how Halloween crossed the Atlantic Ocean and became an American phenomenon is a story of immigration, cultural collision, and gradual transformation. It is a story that spans centuries and involves multiple waves of newcomers bringing their old world customs to a new land, where those customs would encounter resistance, adaptation, and eventually widespread acceptance. For much of early American history, Halloween as we know it did not exist. The Puritans who settled in New England, rigid in their Protestant beliefs and deeply suspicious of anything that smacked of Catholic ritual or pagan superstition, wanted nothing to do with All Hallows' Eve. They had fled England in part to escape what they viewed as the corruptions of the Church of England, and they had no intention of bringing Catholic feast days or their associated folk practices to their new settlements. In Puritan communities, celebration itself was often viewed with suspicion. Christmas was banned in Massachusetts for a time. Frivolity, costuming, and the kind of communal revelry associated with Halloween were antithetical to the Puritan worldview. In the southern colonies and in the middle colonies, where Anglican and other Protestant traditions held sway, there was somewhat more openness to celebration and festival, but Halloween still had no real foothold. The calendar of observances was different, the cultural mix was different, and the old Celtic and Catholic traditions simply had not taken root in any significant way. This began to change in the 19th century with the massive waves of immigration from Ireland and Scotland. The Irish in particular arrived in enormous numbers, especially during and after the Great Famine of the 1840s, one of the most catastrophic humanitarian disasters of the 19th century. Between 1845 and 1852, a blight destroyed Ireland's potato crops, the staple food for millions of poor Irish people. Starvation, disease, and death swept through the country. An estimated 1 million people died. Another million or more fled, most of them to America, crossing the Atlantic in crowded, disease-ridden ships that became known as coffin ships because so many passengers died en route. These Irish immigrants brought with them their culture, their religion, their music, their stories, and their traditions, including the customs associated with All Hallows' Eve. They settled in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, creating vibrant Irish-American communities where the old ways could be maintained and passed down. They carved turnips into jack-o'-lanterns, though in America they soon discovered that pumpkins, native to the New World and far larger and easier to carve than turnips, made excellent substitutes. The glowing pumpkin jack-o'-lantern, now so quintessentially American and so central to Halloween imagery, was born from this practical adaptation. The Irish brought guising, the practice of dressing in costume and going door to door. They brought the tradition of playing pranks and mischief on All Hallows Eve, a night when normal rules could be bent or broken. They brought stories of ghosts and fairies, of the thin veil between worlds, of the need to appease the spirits. These traditions, carried across an ocean and transplanted into American soil, began to take on new forms. Initially, Halloween celebrations in America were largely confined to these immigrant communities. The broader American culture, still heavily influenced by Protestant suspicion of Catholic and foreign customs, regarded these Halloween activities with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. But over time, as Irish and Scottish immigrants became more integrated into American society, and as successive generations of Irish Americans and Scottish Americans became simply Americans, Halloween began to spread. By the late 19th century, Halloween was gaining traction beyond immigrant enclaves. It was becoming Americanized, losing some of its explicit religious connotations and taking on a more secular, community-oriented character. Newspapers began publishing articles about Halloween parties and Halloween customs. Women's magazines offered suggestions for Halloween decorations and games. The holiday was being domesticated, brought into the realm of respectable middle-class entertainment. Halloween parties became popular, especially among young adults. These parties featured games derived from the old divination practices. Bobbing for apples, where participants tried to grab floating apples with their teeth, was a direct descendant of ancient apple divination rituals, trying to bite an apple suspended on a string, or attempting to read the future in the patterns of apple peels. These were old Celtic customs repackaged as parlor games for Victorian and Edwardian Americans. The parties also featured ghost stories, fortune-telling, and elaborate decorations meant to evoke a spooky, mysterious atmosphere. Black and orange, the colors of death and harvest, became the signature colors of Halloween. Images of witches, black cats, bats, skeletons, and ghosts proliferated. These were drawn from a mix of European folklore, Gothic literature, and American imagination. The witch, in particular, became a central Halloween figure, though the witches of Halloween were often depicted as cackling, hook-nosed hags on broomsticks, a far cry from the accused women who had been executed during witch trials centuries earlier. At the same time, Halloween was also becoming associated with mischief and vandalism, particularly among boys and young men. The idea that All Hallows Eve was a night when the normal social order was temporarily suspended, when tricks and pranks were permissible, took on a life of its own in American cities and towns. What had once been relatively harmless pranks, tipping over outhouses, soaping windows, ringing doorbells and running away, began to escalate. By the early 20th century, Halloween mischief had become a serious problem in many American communities. Vandalism, property destruction, and even violence were becoming common. Young people, often emboldened by anonymity and the cover of darkness, would overturn garbage cans, damage fences, slash tires, throw eggs and rotten vegetables, and engage in increasingly destructive behavior. Some communities saw near riots on Halloween night. Civic leaders, parents, and law enforcement struggled to control the chaos. The response to this Halloween mayhem was a concerted effort to reform the holiday, to channel the energies of young people into more constructive and supervised activities. This movement, which gained momentum in the 1920s and 1930s, sought to make Halloween a holiday for children, focused on community events, parties, and organized activities rather than unsupervised roaming and vandalism. Towns and cities began organizing Halloween parades, carnivals, and parties in schools, community centers, and churches. These events provided structured entertainment, costume contests, games, and treats. The idea was to give children a safe, fun, supervised way to celebrate Halloween, thereby reducing the incentive for destructive mischief. This was the era when Halloween began to be explicitly marketed toward children, when it began to take on the more innocent, playful character that we associate with it today. This brings us to one of the most iconic and enduring Halloween traditions, trick or treating. The origins of trick or treating as we know it are somewhat murky, a blend of influences and a product of gradual evolution rather than a single moment of invention. It drew from the old practices of solling and guising, where people went door to door requesting food or money. It drew from the American tradition of Halloween mischief, the idea that if you did not provide a treat, you might suffer a trick. The phrase trick or treat itself seems to have emerged in North America in the 1920s and 1930s. Early references appear in newspapers and local accounts from various parts of the United States and Canada. The practice involved children, dressed in costumes, going from house to house and asking for treats, with the implicit or explicit threat of a prank if no treat was provided. Initially, the treats might be homemade cookies, popcorn balls, fruit, nuts, or coins. The idea of giving out individually wrapped commercial candy came later. Trick-or-treating did not immediately become a nationwide phenomenon. It spread gradually, community by community, gaining popularity through the 1930s. Then came World War II, and many Halloween activities were curtailed. Sugar rationing made treats scarce. Communities focused on the war effort. Halloween celebrations became smaller, more subdued. After the war, in the late 1940s and especially in the 1950s, trick-or-treating exploded in popularity. This was the era of the post-war baby boom, of suburban expansion, of a growing consumer culture. Suburbs, with their relative safety, their clusters of family homes, and their child-centered culture, were ideal environments for trick-or-treating. Children could walk from house to house in their neighborhoods, supervised loosely by parents, collecting treats in a festive, communal activity. Candy companies saw an opportunity. They began marketing small, individually wrapped candies specifically for Halloween. This was a significant shift. Homemade treats, once the norm, became less common, partly due to concerns about safety and partly because pre-packaged candies were simply more convenient. By the 1950s and 1960s, Halloween was becoming a major commercial holiday, second only to Christmas in terms of consumer spending. The costumes children wore evolved as well. In the early days of trick-or-treating in America, costumes were often homemade, cobbled together from old clothes and household items. Children might dress as ghosts using old sheets, as hobos using patched clothes, as witches using black dresses and pointed hats made from construction paper. But as Halloween became commercialized, mass-produced costumes became available, allowing children to dress as their favorite characters from movies, television shows, comic books, and popular culture. Before we continue our journey through Halloween's evolution, I want to pause and ask you something. Leave a comment below and let us know what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or just check in and let us know how you're doing. Thank you for being such an important part of our little corner of the internet. Your presence here, listening to these stories, means more than you know. Now, back to the transformation of Halloween in 20th century America. The shift toward a child-centered, commercialized Halloween was not without its critics. Some lamented the loss of the holiday's older, more mysterious character. Others worried about the rampant consumerism, the way Halloween had become an excuse to sell costumes, candy, and decorations. Still others raised concerns about safety. particularly as urban legends about poisoned candy and razor blades in apples began to circulate in the 1970s and 1980s. These fears, largely unfounded but widely publicized, led to changes in how Halloween was celebrated. Parents became more cautious, accompanying younger children on their trick-or-treating rounds, inspecting candy before allowing children to eat it, and sometimes opting for organized events like school parties or mall trick-or-treating rather than traditional neighborhood door-to-door visits. Some communities established trunk-or-treat events where families would decorate their car trunks in parking lots and distribute candy in a more controlled environment. Despite these shifts in concerns, Halloween continued to grow in popularity. By the late 20th century, it was firmly established as a major American holiday, celebrated not just by children but increasingly by adults as well. Halloween parties for adults became common, often featuring elaborate costumes, themed decorations, and a playful embrace of the spooky and macabre. College towns and urban neighborhoods became known for their Halloween festivities, sometimes drawing thousands of costumed revelers. The commercialization of Halloween reached new heights. By the early 21st century, Americans were spending billions of dollars annually on Halloween, purchasing costumes, candy, decorations, greeting cards, and party supplies. The holiday had become a significant economic event, with retailers devoting entire sections of their stores to Halloween merchandise starting as early as late summer. Halloween also became increasingly globalized, spreading to countries that had no historical connection to Samhain or All Hallows' Eve. In places like Japan, parts of Europe, and Latin America, Halloween emerged as a cultural import, often divorced from its historical and religious roots, celebrated as a fun, secular holiday focused on costumes and parties. The imagery of Halloween, pumpkins, ghosts, witches, became recognizable worldwide, a testament to the power of American cultural influence and the appeal of a holiday that allowed people to dress up, indulge in sweets, and embrace the playfully spooky. Yet even as Halloween became a global, commercialized phenomenon, traces of its older meanings persisted. The timing remained the same: late October, the cusp of winter, the darkening of the year. The themes remained centered on death, the supernatural, and the uncanny. The practice of disguise, of wearing masks and costumes, still echoed that ancient impulse to hide from or confuse the spirits. The giving of treats still carried faint echoes of those offerings left out to appease the wandering dead. The Mexican celebration of Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, observed on November 1st and 2nd, shares this same time of year and similar themes, though distinct from Halloween in its origins and practices. Rooted in indigenous Mesoamerican traditions combined with Catholic All Saints and All Souls Days, Dia de los Muertos also honors the dead, builds altars with offerings of food and flowers, and embraces the idea that at this time of year, the barrier between the living and the dead is permeable. In areas where Mexican and American cultures intersect, particularly in the American Southwest, Halloween and Dia de los Muertos coexist, sometimes blending, sometimes remaining distinct, but both acknowledging this season of death and remembrance. The role of media and popular culture in shaping modern Halloween cannot be overstated. From the early 20th century onward, Halloween became intertwined with entertainment, with movies, television, literature, and later, the internet, all contributing to the holiday's imagery and traditions. The horror genre in particular found a natural home in Halloween, and Halloween found much of its modern aesthetic in horror. Early horror films, the silent German expressionist movies of the 1920s, The Universal monster movies of the 1930s and 1940s featuring Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, and the Wolfman. These created iconic images that became inseparable from Halloween. The monsters themselves, though drawn from European folklore and Gothic literature, became Halloween staples through cinema. Children dressed as Dracula or Frankenstein's monster for trick-or-treating. Their costumes inspired by actors like Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. The 1950s and 1960s saw television embrace Halloween. Sitcoms and variety shows aired special Halloween episodes. Cartoons featured Halloween themes. The 1966 television special It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, based on Charles Schulz's Peanuts comic strip, became an instant classic, airing annually and shaping how generations of American children understood and anticipated Halloween. Linus, waiting in the pumpkin patch for the Great Pumpkin, a mythical figure who never appears, became an endearing and enduring image of childhood faith and Halloween magic. Horror comics, particularly those published by EC Comics in the 1950s, brought gruesome, supernatural stories to young readers, though they faced significant backlash and censorship. The horror anthology format, with its twist endings and macabre tales, became a template that would be revisited countless times in later Halloween entertainment. These comics, though controversial, fed a growing appetite for scary stories, for the thrill of controlled fear that Halloween uniquely provided. The 1970s marked a turning point in Halloween horror with the release of John Carpenter's Halloween in 1978. This independent slasher film, made on a shoestring budget, became a massive success and spawned an entire subgenre of horror films. Its masked killer, Michael Myers, stalking babysitters on Halloween night, created a new association between the holiday and terror, one that was more visceral and violent than the playful spookiness of earlier Halloween imagery. The film's success led to countless imitators and sequels, cementing Halloween as the horror holiday, the night when movie theaters and later home video would be filled with scary movies. This darker, more adult-oriented Halloween found expression beyond film. Haunted houses and haunted attractions became increasingly elaborate and intense. What had once been simple walk-through attractions with volunteers and sheets saying boo evolved into sophisticated, theatrical experiences with professional actors, elaborate sets, special effects, and genuinely frightening scenarios. Some haunted attractions pushed boundaries, incorporating extreme elements, physical contact, and psychological terror. These attractions drew crowds willing to pay significant sums to be scared, to test their courage, to experience controlled danger. The rise of the internet and social media further transformed Halloween. Online communities shared costume ideas, decoration tutorials, and elaborate yard displays. Halloween became a time for creative expression, with people spending weeks or months planning and executing increasingly ambitious costumes and home decorations. Entire neighborhoods became known for their Halloween displays, drawing visitors from miles away. Some homeowners created full-scale haunted yards, complete with animatronics, fog machines, lighting effects, and soundtracks, transforming their properties into temporary attractions. Social media amplified this trend. People posted photos of their costumes, their decorations, their Halloween parties, seeking likes and shares and validation. Halloween became performative in new ways, not just the act of dressing up and going door to door, but the act of documenting and sharing that experience online. Influencers and content creators built followings around Halloween content. YouTube channels dedicated to Halloween decorating, haunted attraction reviews, and horror movie discussions flourished. The commercialization reached new extremes. Spirit Halloween, a seasonal retailer that operates pop-up stores, became a cultural phenomenon in its own right, taking over empty retail spaces every autumn and offering an overwhelming array of costumes, decorations, and animatronics. The company's growth mirrored Halloween's growth, each feeding the other. Walking into a Spirit Halloween store in September became, for many Americans, the unofficial start of the Halloween season, even as the actual holiday was still weeks away. Adult participation in Halloween continued to expand. Costume parties for adults became increasingly elaborate, with some people spending hundreds of dollars on professionally made or custom costumes. Halloween became an opportunity for adults to engage in play, to temporarily become someone or something else, to indulge in fantasy and creativity. For some, it was the one night a year when social norms relaxed enough to allow for outrageous self-expression. Halloween's journey from ancient Celtic hilltops to modern American suburbs is a testament to the adaptability of cultural traditions, the way they can cross oceans and centuries, shedding some elements, acquiring new ones, and yet retaining some essential core. What began as a deadly serious attempt to navigate the dangers of winter and the terrors of the spirit world became a night of playful fun for children, a commercial bonanza for retailers, and a global cultural phenomenon. But beneath the candy wrappers and plastic costumes, beneath the commercialism and the parties, there remains something of that older holiday, that acknowledgement of darkness, of death, of the thin places where the world we know borders on the world we do not. Halloween invites us, for one night, to play with our fears, to dress up as the things that frighten us, to laugh at skeletons and ghosts, to light jack-o'-lanterns against the dark. And perhaps, in some small way, we are still doing what the Celts did, marking the turning of the season, acknowledging the mysteries that surround us, and finding comfort in ritual, community, and the flicker of light against the encroaching night. The dark side of Halloween, witch trials, moral panics, and cultural controversies. To understand Halloween fully, we must examine not just how it evolved into a beloved holiday, but also the darker currents that have run through its history, the fears it has provoked, the controversies it has sparked, and the very real human suffering that occurred in the name of combating witchcraft and supernatural evil. This segment takes us into the shadowy territory of witch trials, moral panics, and the ongoing cultural tensions surrounding a holiday that, despite its playful modern veneer, still touches on deeply held beliefs about good and evil, the sacred and the profane. The figure of the witch looms large in Halloween iconography. The cackling hag with her pointed hat, broomstick, and black cat has become one of the holiday's most recognizable symbols. But this cartoonish image obscures a horrifying historical reality. The European and American witch trials of the early modern period, roughly from the 15th through the 18th centuries, resulted in the torture and execution of tens of thousands of people, the vast majority of them women, accused of practicing witchcraft and consorting with the devil. The witch hunts were not a medieval phenomenon, as popular imagination often assumes, but rather a product of the early modern period, an era of religious upheaval, social anxiety, and profound uncertainty. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Christian Europe. Wars of religion raged. The Catholic Church and various Protestant denominations competed for souls and power. The Bible was being translated into vernacular languages, making it accessible to ordinary people, but also opening it to diverse and sometimes heretical interpretations. In this atmosphere of religious fervor and fear, the idea that Satan was actively working through human agents, through witches, gained terrifying traction. The belief in witchcraft was not new. Folk magic, healing practices, divination, and appeals to supernatural forces had existed for centuries in European peasant culture. But what changed in the early modern period was the systematization and demonization of these practices. Church and secular authorities, armed with texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, developed elaborate theories about how witches operated, how they made pacts with the devil, how they flew through the air to attend Sabbaths where they worshipped Satan and performed obscene rituals. The Malleus Maleficarum, written by German clergyman Heinrich Kramer, was essentially a handbook for identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting witches. It was deeply misogynistic, arguing that women were more susceptible to the devil's influence because they were weaker, more carnal, and more intellectually inferior than men. The text went through numerous editions and was widely distributed, providing a template for witch hunters across Europe, the process of which prosecution typically began with an accusation. Someone in a community, a neighbor, a relative, an acquaintance, would accuse another person, usually a woman, of witchcraft. The accused might be a midwife whose patients had died, an elderly woman who lived alone and was considered odd or disagreeable, a healer whose remedies had failed, or simply someone who had fallen out with neighbors over property disputes or personal grievances. In times of hardship, when crops failed, when children died, when cattle sickened, people looked for explanations, and witchcraft provided a convenient scapegoat. Once accused, the suspect would be arrested and interrogated. Torture was routinely employed to extract confessions. The methods were brutal, designed to inflict maximum pain and break the will of the accused. Strappado, where the victim's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted into the air by a rope, dislocating shoulders. The rack, which stretched the body until joints separated. Thumbscrews, which crushed fingers and toes. Sleep deprivation, starvation, repeated dunking in water. Under such torment, people would confess to anything, would implicate others, would provide the detailed descriptions of Sabbaths and devil worship that their interrogators demanded. The confessions obtained through torture were then used as evidence in trials. The accused, often without legal representation, faced judges who were predisposed to believe in their guilt. Spectral evidence, testimony that the accused spirit or spectre had appeared to the witness and caused harm, was sometimes admitted, a standard of proof that made defense nearly impossible. How could one prove they had not sent their spirit to torment someone? Execution methods varied. In German lands and many parts of continental Europe, convicted witches were burned at the stake, a death that was both agonizing and symbolically significant, as fire was believed to purify. In England and the American colonies, hanging was more common. Some were drowned, others were strangled before being burned. The executions were public spectacles, attended by crowds, meant to serve as warnings and demonstrations of authorities' power over evil. The scale of the witch trials varied by region. Some areas saw dozens or even hundreds of executions. The Würzburg and Bamberg witch trials in Germany in the 1620s resulted in hundreds of deaths. The Basque witch trials in Spain, though ultimately resulting in fewer executions due to the intervention of the Spanish Inquisition, which ironically applied more rigorous standards of evidence, still terrorized communities. In Scotland, thousands were tried and hundreds executed. In Switzerland, France, Poland, throughout Europe, the witch hunts left trails of blood and ash. The most famous witch trials in the English-speaking world occurred in Salem, Massachusetts. In 1692, the Salem witch trials, though resulting in fewer deaths than many European trials, have become emblematic of witch hunt hysteria due to their occurrence in colonial America and their extensive documentation. The trials began when several young girls in Salem Village, began exhibiting strange behavior, fits, convulsions, and claims of being tormented by invisible forces. They accused local women of bewitching them. The accusations spread rapidly. In a Puritan community already anxious about its spiritual state, already fearful of Native American attacks on the frontier, already riven by internal disputes over land and church authority, the witch accusations provided a focal point for collective anxiety. More and more people were accused. The accused included not just marginal figures, but respected members of the community, even former ministers. The trials became a mechanism through which old grudges could be settled, through which social tensions could be expressed. Over the course of several months in 1692, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft in Salem and the surrounding areas. 30 were found guilty. 19 were hanged on Gallows Hill. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones when he refused to enter a plea, a gruesome execution method intended to force compliance. Several others died in prison awaiting trial. The trials finally ended when the governor of Massachusetts, influenced by clergy who questioned the reliability of spectral evidence and disturbed by the accusations spreading to include members of the colonial elite, dissolved the special court hearing the cases. The aftermath of the Salem trials included soul-searching and regret. Some of the accusers later recanted. One of the judges, Samuel Sewall, publicly apologized. The colonial government eventually provided restitution to the families of some of the victims. But the damage was done. Lives were lost, families destroyed, and a community traumatized. Salem became a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria, the unreliability of spectral evidence, and the ease with which fear and suspicion can spiral into tragedy. The witch trials in Europe and America eventually declined and ended, not because people stopped believing in witchcraft, but because standards of evidence changed, because Enlightenment rationalism began to challenge supernatural explanations, and because authorities recognized that the trials themselves were causing more harm than any alleged witches. By the late 18th century, witch executions had largely ceased in Europe and America, though belief in witchcraft persisted in folk culture for much longer. These historical witch trials cast a long shadow over Halloween. The witch, transformed into a Halloween icon, carries echoes of this brutal history. When children dress as witches for Halloween, when decorations feature witches on broomsticks, there is rarely any acknowledgement of the real women who were tortured and killed. The Halloween, which has been sanitized, made cartoonish and harmless, stripped of historical context. This is perhaps necessary for a children's holiday, but it is worth remembering what lies beneath the costume. Halloween has also been the subject of more recent moral panics and controversies, particularly from religious groups who view the holiday as incompatible with Christian faith. For some conservative Christians, Halloween's pagan origins, its association with the occult, and its celebration of darkness and death make it spiritually dangerous. They argue that participating in Halloween, even in its modern, secularized form, opens doors to demonic influence, that it normalizes witchcraft and the supernatural in ways that are antithetical to Christian teaching. This religious opposition to Halloween has taken various forms. Some churches have created alternative celebrations. Harvest festivals or Reformation Day parties held on October 31st that provide Halloween-like activities, costumes and games and treats, but stripped of spooky or supernatural elements and reframed in explicitly Christian terms. Some Christian parents refuse to allow their children to participate in Halloween at all, viewing it as a celebration of evil. In the 1980s and early 1990s, a particularly intense moral panic swept through parts of America, centered on allegations of widespread satanic ritual abuse. This panic, fueled by sensationalized media coverage, dubious testimony from supposed survivors, and a cultural atmosphere of anxiety about child safety, led to claims that organized networks of Satanists were abusing children in daycare centers, using them in ritual sacrifices, and indoctrinating them into devil worship. Halloween, with its imagery of witches, devils, and darkness, became associated in some minds with this alleged satanic conspiracy. The Satanic Panic, as it came to be known, resulted in numerous prosecutions, many of which were later overturned when evidence was found to be unreliable or fabricated. Interrogation techniques used on children were deeply flawed, using leading questions and pressure that produced false memories. Adults were convicted and imprisoned based on testimony that, upon later examination, could not be corroborated and often described events that were physically impossible. The panic eventually subsided as investigations failed to uncover evidence of organized satanic networks, and as the psychological and legal communities recognized the problems with the testimony that had driven the prosecutions. But during the height of the Satanic Panic, Halloween came under particular scrutiny. Some communities banned Halloween celebrations in schools. Parents were warned to inspect candy for signs of tampering, fears stoked by largely unsubstantiated claims of poisoned treats and razor blades in apples, while isolated incidents of candy tampering did occur. They were extremely rare and often turned out to be hoaxes or cases where family members, not strangers, were responsible. But the fear persisted, changing how many families approached trick-or-treating. Halloween has also faced criticism from other perspectives. Some people of color have pointed out that Halloween costumes can perpetuate harmful stereotypes and engage in cultural appropriation. Costumes that caricature indigenous peoples, that reduce entire cultures to crude stereotypes, that involve blackface or other racist elements, have been marketed and worn, often by people who claim ignorance of the offense they cause. This has led to ongoing conversations about what constitutes an appropriate Halloween costume, about the line between homage and appropriation, about who gets to represent whom. Gender has been another point of controversy. The trend toward increasingly sexualized costumes for women, the sexy nurse, sexy cop, sexy anything phenomenon, has been criticized as reinforcing objectification and limiting how women can participate in Halloween. While some women embrace these costumes as a form of empowerment or playful expression, others see them as symptomatic of broader cultural problems around how women's bodies are commodified and consumed. Despite these controversies, or perhaps partly because of them, Halloween remains hugely popular. It continues to evolve, to adapt, to generate debate. It serves as a kind of cultural canvas onto which we project our anxieties, our desires, our beliefs about good and evil, about community and individualism, about childhood innocence and adult cynicism. Halloween is a holiday that accommodates contradiction, that can be simultaneously wholesome and transgressive, innocent and dark, commercial and countercultural. The witch trials remind us that the supernatural, the fear of unseen forces, the human tendency to scapegoat and to seek simple explanations for complex misfortunes, these are not merely historical curiosities. They speak to enduring aspects of human psychology and social behavior. Halloween, in its modern form, allows us to play with these fears in a controlled, safe way. We dress as witches and monsters, we watch horror movies, we walk through haunted houses, and then we go home, turn on the lights, and return to normal life. The holiday provides a release valve, a sanctioned space for acknowledging darkness without being consumed by it. Yet the history of witch trials also serves as a warning. It shows us how quickly rationality can give way to hysteria, how easily accusations can destroy lives, how dangerous it is when fear overrides evidence and due process. The satanic panic of the 1980s, though less deadly than the witch trials of centuries past, demonstrated that we are not immune to these impulses, that even in a modern, supposedly enlightened society, moral panic can take hold and cause real harm. The relationship between Halloween and organized religion remains complex and evolving. While some Christian denominations and individual churches continue to oppose Halloween, others have embraced it or found ways to participate that align with their faith. Some churches host trunk or treat events in their parking lots, providing a safe, community-oriented alternative to neighborhood trick or treating. Others incorporate Halloween into their youth programs, using it as an opportunity to engage young people in discussions about faith, fear, and how to navigate cultural traditions. The Catholic Church, from which All Hallows' Eve derives its name, has a particularly nuanced relationship with Halloween. Official church teaching does not condemn Halloween celebrations, recognizing them as largely secular and cultural rather than religious. Some Catholic parishes host Halloween parties or festivals. Others emphasize the religious significance of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, encouraging parishioners to attend Mass and pray for the dead, while remaining largely neutral about Halloween festivities. In recent decades, some practitioners of modern paganism and Wicca have sought to reclaim Samhain as a religious observance. These contemporary pagans, drawing on Celtic traditions and attempting to reconstruct or reimagine ancient practices, celebrate Samhain as a sacred festival honoring the dead, marking the turning of the wheel of the year and acknowledging the thinning of the veil between worlds. For them, Samhain is not about costumes and candy, but about spiritual reflection, ancestor veneration, and connection to the cycles of nature. This reclamation of Samhain by modern pagans has sometimes created tension with Halloween. Some pagans view the commercialized Halloween as a corruption or trivialization of what they consider a serious religious observance. Others see no conflict, participating in both Halloween festivities and private Samhain rituals. The overlap in timing and some shared imagery, pumpkins, autumn leaves, themes of death, and the supernatural, can create confusion, but for most people, Halloween and Samhain remain distinct. One, a secular cultural celebration, the other, a religious holy day for a relatively small religious community. The psychology of Halloween, why people enjoy being scared, why they embrace the macabre, has been the subject of academic study. Researchers have explored the appeal of controlled fear, the way horror movies, haunted houses, and spooky stories allow people to experience adrenaline and excitement in a safe context. The brain releases dopamine during frightening experiences, creating a natural high. For many people, especially adolescents and young adults, seeking out scary experiences is a way to test courage, to prove toughness, and to bond with peers through shared thrills. Halloween provides a culturally sanctioned opportunity for this kind of thrill-seeking. It gives permission to explore the dark side, to think about death and danger, to confront fears in a playful, temporary way. The costumes allow for experimentation with identity, for trying on different personas, for expressing aspects of oneself that might normally be suppressed. A shy person might dress as a superhero. Someone who feels powerless might dress as a villain. The costume becomes a mask in the psychological sense, allowing for behaviors and expressions that the everyday self might not permit. For children, Halloween serves developmental functions. It allows them to work through fears about monsters, ghosts, and the dark, by making those fears concrete, and manageable. When a child dresses as a ghost or a monster, they take control of what frightens them, transforming from victim to master of the scary thing. The ritual of trick-or-treating teaches social skills, how to approach strangers, how to say please and thank you, how to navigate neighborhoods. The sugar rush of candy consumption, while concerning to dentists and nutritionists, is a rare and therefore special indulgence that makes the holiday memorable and anticipated. Halloween also functions as a liminal space in the anthropological sense, a threshold time when normal rules are suspended. Anthropologists who study ritual and festival have long noted that certain celebrations create temporary zones where social hierarchies are inverted, where transgression is permitted, where the everyday order of things is challenged or playfully mocked. Medieval European carnival traditions, the Feast of Fools, these served similar functions, allowing common people to mock authority, to engage in excess, to temporarily escape the constraints of their social positions. Halloween in contemporary America carries some of these liminal qualities. It is a night when children roam freely, when strangers interact with children in ways that would be suspicious on any other night, when houses that are normally private open their doors to anyone who knocks, when people wear masks and disguises, when pranks and mischief are, within limits, tolerated. The normal boundaries and rules are loosened, creating a space for play, for community interaction, for controlled chaos. The economic impact of Halloween has grown tremendously. By the early 21st century, Halloween had become the second largest commercial holiday in the United States after Christmas. Americans spend billions annually on costumes, decorations, candy, and greeting cards. The National Retail Federation tracks Halloween spending, reporting year after year increases in consumer expenditure. The holiday has become a significant driver of retail sales in the fall, with stores devoting increasingly large amounts of floor space to Halloween merchandise and starting their Halloween promotions earlier each year. This commercialization has created industries and jobs. Seasonal Halloween stores employ thousands of workers. Candy manufacturers produce special Halloween packaging and products. Costume designers and manufacturers create new designs each year, responding to trends in popular culture. The haunted attraction industry has professionalized with trade shows, industry publications, and specialized vendors selling everything from animatronic monsters to theatrical fog machines. What began as a folk tradition has become a major economic sector. Critics of this commercialization argue that Halloween has lost its soul, that it has become just another excuse for retailers to sell products, that the true meaning of the holiday, whatever that might be, has been buried under mountains of plastic decorations and mass-produced costumes. Defenders counter that the commercial aspect is simply how holidays function in a capitalist consumer society, that it provides jobs and economic activity, and that people are free to celebrate Halloween in whatever way they choose. Whether that means spending hundreds of dollars on decorations or simply carving a pumpkin and handing out candy. As we continue through Halloween's story, we will see how the holiday has been embraced, contested, transformed, and reinvented. We will see how it has spread globally, how different cultures have adapted it to their own contexts, and how it continues to serve as a mirror reflecting our collective fascinations and fears. Halloween is more than just a night of costumes and candy. It is a cultural phenomenon with deep roots, complex meanings, and an ongoing ability to provoke, delight, and disturb. Halloween around the world and into the future, global spread, cultural adaptation, and modern evolution as we reach the final chapter of our journey through Halloween's long and winding history. We turn our attention to how this distinctly Celtic, then European, then American holiday has spread across the globe. How different cultures have adapted it to their own contexts, and what the future might hold for a celebration that has proven remarkably resilient and adaptable across more than 2 millennia. The globalization of Halloween is a relatively recent phenomenon, largely a product of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. While Halloween had deep roots in Celtic and European traditions, and had been thoroughly Americanized by the mid-20th century, it remained largely unknown in most of the world until American cultural influence, through movies, television, music, and eventually the internet, began to export Halloween imagery and practices globally. Japan provides a fascinating case study in Halloween's international spread. Halloween was virtually unknown in Japan until the 1970s, when it was introduced primarily through English-language schools and expatriate communities. Initially, it remained a niche celebration, limited to foreigners and Japanese people interested in Western culture. But in the 1990s, and especially in the 2000s, Halloween began to gain traction, not as a children's trick-or-treating holiday, but as an excuse for elaborate costume parties and street celebrations among young adults. Tokyo's Shibuya district became famous, or perhaps infamous, for its massive Halloween street gatherings, where tens of thousands of costumed revelers would pack the streets, taking photos, showing off costumes, and creating a carnival atmosphere. The costumes often reflected Japanese pop culture, anime characters, video game heroes, and uniquely Japanese interpretations of Western Halloween themes. The event grew so large that it eventually required significant police presence and crowd control measures. After incidents of vandalism and overcrowding, authorities began implementing restrictions, asking people not to gather in Shibuya, though the celebrations continued in modified forms. Japanese retailers embraced Halloween enthusiastically. Theme parks like Tokyo Disneyland and Universal Studios Japan created elaborate Halloween events. Stores sold Halloween decorations and costumes. Food companies released Halloween-themed products, pumpkin-flavored everything, special Halloween packaging. For Japanese businesses, Halloween represented an opportunity, a new occasion for consumer spending in the relatively quiet period between summer and the December holiday season. The Japanese embrace of Halloween is selective and creative. There is little emphasis on the supernatural or scary aspects. Instead, Halloween is primarily about costumes, about kawaii, cute aesthetics, about performance and display. It has been adapted to fit existing Japanese cultural practices around costume play, known as cosplay, and seasonal celebrations. The holiday has been made Japanese, stripped of Christian or Celtic religious connotations, and transformed into a secular celebration of creativity and fashion. In Latin America, Halloween has spread, but often exists alongside and sometimes blends with the indigenous celebration of Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. In Mexico, Dia de los Muertos is a deeply rooted tradition, a time when families build altars, called ofrendas, to honor deceased loved ones, decorating them with marigolds, photos, candles, and the favorite foods and drinks of the departed. Families visit cemeteries, clean graves, and spend time remembering and celebrating those who have died. The tone is not somber but celebratory, acknowledging death as a natural part of life and maintaining connection with ancestors. As American Halloween has moved into Mexico and other Latin American countries, sometimes through American expatriate communities, sometimes through media influence, sometimes through commercial promotion, it has created interesting cultural dynamics. Some people, particularly in urban areas and among younger generations, participate in both Halloween and Dia de los Muertos. Children might go trick-or-treating on October 31st and then participate in traditional Day of the Dead observances on November 1st and 2nd. Others view Halloween as a foreign import that threatens to overshadow authentic cultural traditions. The skull imagery used in Day of the Dead celebrations, the colorful sugar skulls and skeleton decorations, has sometimes been appropriated into Halloween aesthetics, particularly in the United States, creating accusations of cultural appropriation. Mexican and Mexican-American communities have pushed back against this, arguing that sacred symbols are being commodified and stripped of their cultural and religious meaning, turned into costume accessories and party decorations by people who do not understand or respect their significance. In Europe, Halloween's return to the continent of its origins has been uneven. Ireland and Scotland, where Halloween has the deepest historical roots, have maintained continuous traditions, though these have been heavily influenced by American practices. In Ireland, Halloween remains a major celebration, with bonfires, parties, traditional foods like barmbrack, a fruit bread with objects baked inside for fortune-telling, and fireworks. The Irish have embraced some American elements, trick-or-treating and costume parties, while maintaining connections to older traditions. In the United Kingdom, more broadly, Halloween has grown in popularity, particularly since the 1980s, though it faces competition from Guy Fawkes Night on November 5th, a traditional British celebration involving bonfires and fireworks. Some British people celebrate both. Others view Halloween as an unwelcome American import. British retailers have promoted Halloween enthusiastically, seeing it as a commercial opportunity which has helped drive its adoption, particularly among children and young people. In continental Europe, Halloween's reception has been mixed. Some countries, particularly those with strong Catholic traditions, have been resistant, viewing Halloween as unnecessary when they already have All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day in France. There was a brief attempt in the 1990s by retailers to promote Halloween, but it largely failed to take root beyond novelty status. Germans have been more receptive, with Halloween parties and decorations becoming more common, though the holiday remains far less significant than traditional German festivals like Carnival or Christmas markets. Eastern Europe has seen gradual adoption of Halloween, particularly in urban areas and among younger generations exposed to American media and culture. In countries that were formerly part of the Soviet bloc, Halloween represents a kind of Western modernity, a connection to global youth culture, but it often remains superficial, limited to costume parties in clubs and bars rather than the full suite of Halloween traditions. The spread of Halloween globally raises interesting questions about cultural homogenization and the power of American cultural exports. Critics argue that Halloween's global spread is a form of cultural imperialism, that American consumer culture is displacing local traditions, that multinational corporations are using Halloween to create new markets and drive consumption. They point to the commercialization, the way Halloween is often introduced through retail promotion rather than organic cultural exchange, as evidence that this is primarily an economic rather than a cultural phenomenon. Defenders of Halloween's spread counter that culture has always traveled. The traditions have always been borrowed, adapted, and transformed. They argue that people in other countries are not passive victims of American cultural imperialism, but active agents who choose which aspects of Halloween to adopt, how to adapt them to local contexts, and what meanings to assign to them. The Japanese Halloween celebration, very different from the American version, demonstrates that Halloween can be transformed, made into something new and culturally specific rather than simply imitating American practices. The internet and social media have accelerated Halloween's global spread. People around the world can see Halloween celebrations online, can access costume ideas, decoration tutorials, and recipes. Social media platforms encourage participation through hashtags, challenges, and the sharing of photos and videos. Halloween content goes viral, crossing borders instantly. A creative costume or elaborate decoration in one country can inspire imitations worldwide within days. This digital dimension has also changed how Halloween is celebrated, even in countries where it is well established. Instagram-worthy decorations, costumes designed for maximum visual impact in photos, elaborate yard displays meant to be shared online. These reflect how social media has made Halloween increasingly performative. The celebration is not just about the experience itself, but about documenting and sharing that experience, about accumulating likes and comments, about participating in a global conversation. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in 2020, created unprecedented disruption to Halloween celebrations. Trick-or-treating, with its door-to-door interaction and close contact, seemed impossibly risky in the context of a highly contagious respiratory virus. Many communities cancelled or heavily modified Halloween activities. Some families created alternative celebrations, setting up candy shoots or distributing treats in socially distanced ways. Others skipped Halloween entirely, unable or unwilling to navigate the challenges. The pandemic accelerated some trends that were already underway. Virtual Halloween parties and online costume contests became more common. Drive-through haunted attractions, where people remained in their cars, offered a safer alternative to traditional walk-through haunts. Families focused on at-home celebrations, decorating their houses, carving pumpkins, watching Halloween movies. The pandemic demonstrated both Halloween's resilience and its vulnerability, its ability to adapt to changed circumstances, but also its dependence on community interaction and social gathering. As the pandemic receded and restrictions lifted, Halloween celebrations returned with enthusiasm, perhaps reflecting pent-up demand for normalcy and communal joy. Attendance at haunted attractions rebounded. Trick-or-treating resumed. Halloween spending reached new highs. The holiday had survived a global pandemic, emerging, if anything, more popular than before. Looking to the future, several trends seem likely to shape Halloween's continued evolution. Environmental consciousness is influencing how people celebrate. Concerns about plastic waste from disposable decorations and costumes, about the carbon footprint of Halloween-related consumption, are leading some to seek more sustainable options. Thrift store costumes, DIY decorations made from recycled materials, candy alternatives, and reduced consumption are gaining traction among environmentally minded Technology will continue to change Halloween. Augmented reality and virtual reality could create new forms of Halloween entertainment. Imagine haunted house experiences in virtual reality or augmented reality apps that overlay spooky elements onto the real world. Smart home technology allows for increasingly sophisticated lighting and special effects displays. Animatronics and special effects continue to advance, making home and commercial haunted attractions more realistic and immersive. The ongoing debates about cultural appropriation, representation, and inclusion will continue to shape Halloween costume choices and celebrations. There is growing awareness and discussion about what constitutes an appropriate costume, about the harm caused by costumes that perpetuate stereotypes or make light of others' identities and cultures. While some view these discussions as excessive political correctness, others see them as necessary evolution toward a more thoughtful and inclusive society. Halloween's commercial aspects show no signs of diminishing. If anything, the holiday continues to grow as a retail event. with longer selling seasons and ever more elaborate and expensive products available. The boundary between Halloween and fall's seasonal decor has blurred, with pumpkin spice products and autumn-themed merchandise appearing as early as August, creating an extended fall holiday season that encompasses Halloween, Thanksgiving, and the lead-up to Christmas. Yet for all its commercialization and change, Halloween retains something of its ancient character. It remains tied to the autumn season, to the darkening of the year, to themes of death and the supernatural. It still provides an occasion for communities to gather, for neighbors to interact, for traditions to be passed down through generations. Children still dress in costumes and collect candy. Families still carve pumpkins. People still tell ghost stories and watch scary movies. The specific forms have changed dramatically from the Celtic hilltop bonfires and desperate offerings to appease the wandering dead. But the underlying impulses remain recognizable. We still mark this threshold time of year. We still acknowledge darkness, death, and mystery. We still create rituals to navigate our fears and to bind our communities together. We still light jack-o'-lanterns against the encroaching dark. Halloween has proven remarkably adaptable, surviving the fall of the Celtic world. The rise of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation, the migration across the Atlantic, the transformation into a children's holiday, the moral panics and controversies, the commercialization and globalization. It has absorbed influences from multiple cultures and eras, from Roman harvest festivals to Victorian parlor games to 20th century horror films to 21st century social media. What makes Halloween endure is perhaps its flexibility, its ability to accommodate multiple meanings and purposes. For children, it is about dressing up and getting candy. For teenagers, it is about testing boundaries and experiencing thrills. For adults, it is about nostalgia, creativity, and temporary escape from everyday responsibilities. For some, it retains spiritual or religious significance. For others, it is purely secular entertainment. For retailers, it is a commercial opportunity. For communities, it is an occasion for interaction and shared experience. Halloween allows us to play with darkness without being consumed by it, to acknowledge death without being paralyzed by it, to explore our fears in a context where we remain safe. It provides a counterbalance to the relentless optimism and sanitization of much of modern life. A sanctioned space where the grotesque, the macabre, and the frightening are not just permitted but celebrated. As long as humans experience fear, as long as we wonder about what happens after death, as long as we find pleasure in stories and costumes and communal celebration, Halloween in some form will likely persist. Its specific manifestations will continue to change. New traditions will emerge. Old ones will fade or transform. But the essential core, our autumn celebration acknowledging the dark, death, and mystery while bringing communities together in ritual and play that seems likely to endure. From the Celtic farmers who lit bonfires on hilltops 2,000 years ago to the children who will go trick-or-treating in neighborhoods. Around the world this coming October, from the carved turnips of medieval Ireland to the animatronic displays of modern American suburbs, from the solemn prayers for the dead in medieval churches to the costume parties in Tokyo and Mexico City, Halloween's journey has been long, strange, and remarkable. It is a holiday that has died and been reborn many times, that has crossed oceans and centuries, that has been sacred and secular, innocent and transgressive, intensely local and increasingly global. It is a testament to human creativity and adaptability, to our need for ritual and celebration, to our endless fascination with the mysteries that lie just beyond the edge of the known world. As you drift off to sleep tonight, Perhaps you will dream of bonfires on distant hills, of carved pumpkins glowing in the dark, of children in costumes walking through autumn streets, of all the millions of people across time who have marked this season, who have acknowledged the turning of the year, who have lit lights against the encroaching darkness and found comfort in community and ritual. Halloween is more than a holiday. It is a thread running through history, connecting us to our ancestors, to each other, and to the fundamental human experiences of fear, wonder, death, and celebration. It reminds us that we are part of something larger than ourselves, part of a story that began long before we were born and will continue long after we are gone. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed, unlike the people we just learned about. Sleep well.